I became a single father. That phrase still feels foreign to me. Every time I say it, I feel something tighten inside. Being the sole parent is like walking a tightrope without a safety net. One wrong step, and you could lose everything. I was used to responsibility, but managing work, home, and raising an 8-year-old son on my own turned out to be far harder than I had imagined. Every morning starts the same way. Waking up before Tony, making him breakfast, packing his backpack, and ensuring he hasn't forgotten anything. Then comes work, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day just to make ends meet. And in the evenings, I check his homework and read to him before bed. I wouldn't trade this life for anything. Tony is my world. Sometimes, it feels like the past belongs to another life, as if I was a completely different person back then. Everything seemed simple. I was married, worked, and came home to Linda waiting for me. I thought we had the perfect family. How wrong I was. Today, I'll tell you where it all began. Ironically, it started on an ordinary day, one no different from the others. It all began with a parent-teacher meeting. "John, you didn't forget about the meeting at school, did you?" Linda's voice called from the kitchen. I sat on the edge of the bed, buttoning my work shirt, trying to remember if she'd mentioned it before. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. "What meeting?" I asked, trying to hide my confusion. Linda appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a coffee mug in hand. She looked flawless, as always. A light sweater highlighted her slim figure, and her dark hair was neatly tied in a bun. She gave me a teasing smile. "The parent-teacher meeting, John. Tonight at 6. You promised you'd come. Don't tell me you forgot." I rubbed my neck, trying not to show my irritation. Yes, maybe she had mentioned it, but after 10 hours on a construction site and barely any sleep, not much stuck in my head. "Of course, I remember," I lied. "Just wanted to make sure you hadn't forgotten." "Very funny," Linda said, shaking her head. "Just don't be late. We need to show Tony we're on the same page, you know?" She stepped closer and gave me a quick peck on the cheek, leaving behind the scent of her coffee and favorite perfume. I smiled, feeling my irritation dissolve. She always knew how to calm me down, one of the many reasons I loved her so much. The day passed as usual. Calls, clients, hard work at the site. But thoughts of the evening kept creeping back. Parent-teacher meetings had never been my strong suit. I always felt a bit out of place among the other parents. Linda, on the other hand, thrived in those settings. Smiles, casual conversations, organizational skills. She could connect with anyone. When I got home, Tony was already waiting by the door. He was wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt and looked at me like I was about to be late. "Dad, you didn't forget about the meeting, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I remember, Tony. Go grab your jacket," I replied, ruffling his hair. Linda appeared in the hallway, holding the car keys. Her face lit up with a gentle smile. She was clearly happy that we were attending as a family. I couldn't help but notice how stunning she looked. A simple yet elegant dress, light makeup that highlighted her natural beauty. Moments like these made me feel like the luckiest man alive. We arrived at the school on time. The parking lot was packed, and I suddenly remembered why I usually avoided such events. Crowds of parents, endless chatter, waiting. Linda took Tony's hand, and together we walked to the entrance. Inside, parents, teachers, and children were already gathering. The hall buzzed like a beehive. "Hi, Linda." A familiar voice rang out. It was Rebecca, one of her friends from school events. "How are you? You're glowing tonight." "Oh, thanks, Rebecca. You look great too," Linda replied with a smile. "John, do you mind grabbing a seat? I want to chat a bit." I nodded, settling into the center of the hall with Tony. While Linda chatted with her friend, I looked around. Parents were everywhere, some animatedly discussing their kids' achievements, others sharing work updates. Everything seemed so ordinary that I even relaxed. When the meeting began, Linda joined me. The teacher spoke about class activities, student progress, and, of course, mentioned Tony's accomplishments. I felt a swell of pride for my son. Linda leaned over and whispered, "Our boy is brilliant. I think he'll take first place in reading next month." I smiled. Moments like these were rare, but they made me feel like we were a real family. It seemed like nothing could disrupt this harmony. After the meeting, we returned home. Linda went to the kitchen to check on her apple pie, which she'd left in the oven before we left. I sank onto the couch, leaning back with a sense of pleasant exhaustion. "So, what do you think?" Linda asked, appearing in the doorway with a cup of tea. "You were right. I'm glad I went," I admitted. Tony was happy. "See? Sometimes you can listen to me," she said with a smile, sitting down beside me. "And thank you for coming." We sat together, enjoying the quiet. Evenings like this felt like our little victories. At the time, I was sure everything was fine. I couldn't have imagined that just a few months later, this picture would start to crack. But in that moment, I simply savored what we had. Our daily life moved along its usual rhythm. Linda, as always, took care of Tony and the house, while I worked late. We were a real team, as she liked to say. But in recent weeks, I began to notice that Linda had become a little distant. Small things, hard to point out, spending slightly longer on her phone, going out on errands more often. At the time, I suspected nothing, maybe because I didn't want to. One evening, I came home a bit earlier. Work at the construction site finished ahead of schedule, and I decided to stop by the store to pick up something for dinner. When I walked into the house, Linda was in the kitchen. She didn't hear me open the door and looked surprised when she saw me. "Oh, you're home early. Is everything okay?" she asked, quickly setting her phone down on the table. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just decided to wrap up early. What's for dinner?" I replied, nodding toward her phone. "Haven't decided yet. Maybe pasta," she said, dodging the implied question. The next day, everything seemed back to normal. We were sitting at breakfast, and Tony was excitedly telling us about a school project he was working on. "Mom met some guy yesterday," he said suddenly, casually chewing on his toast. I looked up from my plate. Linda froze for a moment, but then chuckled. "What are you talking about, Tony?" Her voice sounded too calm. "Well, I saw you talking to him by the school when you picked me up from practice. He gave you some kind of paper." "Who was that?" Tony asked with the innocent curiosity only a child could have. Linda acted as though his question surprised her, but I noticed her nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. "Oh, that was one of the parents. We were just discussing the practice schedule. You know, Tony, we always have to stay involved with school activities," she explained smoothly and immediately changed the subject. "By the way, how did you like your friend's project?" Tony easily shifted his attention to talking about school, and I pretended everything was fine. But inside, something nagged at me. Some guy. Who could she have been meeting at school? That comment from Tony stayed with me all day. Maybe it really was just another parent. Linda was always actively involved in Tony's school life. But why hadn't she mentioned it? Usually, she told me everything when it came to school. That evening, when I got home, Linda was already sitting on the couch with her laptop. Tony was watching cartoons. I glanced at Linda, trying to gauge if anything about her behavior had changed. She noticed my look and smiled. "How was your day?" she asked, closing the laptop. "Same as usual. Yours?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "Nothing special. Work, groceries, helped Tony with some homework," she replied quickly, then shifted her attention to the TV. I nodded, but Tony's words kept replaying in my mind. Something about it wouldn't let me rest. A few days later, Tony accidentally dropped another comment that made my stomach turn. We were driving to practice when he said out of the blue, "Dad, do you know the guy who talks to Mom at school sometimes? He was there again yesterday." "What guy?" I asked, trying not to sound too interested. "Well, he's tall. He always smiles. Yesterday, he even helped Mom with her bag," Tony replied innocently, turning his focus to his cleats. My heart sank. This couldn't just be a coincidence. A guy, helping with her bag and smiling. Why didn't I know anything about him? Why hadn't Linda mentioned him? That evening, when I got home, Linda was sitting at the table, writing in a notebook. I decided to ask her directly, but carefully. "Linda, who's that guy you meet at school? Tony said he helped you with your bag yesterday." She froze, but there was no look of surprise on her face. She continued writing as if I just asked her about the weather. "He's one of the parents, John. His daughter is in Tony's class. We sometimes cross paths at meetings. You know how it is," she said without looking up. "What's his name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. Matt, I think. Honestly, I barely talk to him, she replied, finally meeting my eyes. Why do you ask? Tony mentioned him a couple of times. That's all, I said, hiding my growing unease. She smiled and returned to her notebook, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After Tony casually mentioned the guy, a sense of unease began to grow inside me. I didn't want to turn into a suspicious husband, constantly looking for hidden meanings in every word. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that Linda was keeping parts of her life from me, details that used to feel like a natural part of our shared existence. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to her behavior. Maybe I was becoming paranoid, but every move she made, every glance, every phone call began to feel suspicious. One evening, when I came home after a long day, I heard her voice coming from the kitchen. Linda was on the phone, her tone warm, soft, with a hint of playfulness. Usually, she talked to Rebecca or another friend like that, but something in her voice made me pause in the hallway. Yes, of course, I'll check. No, it's no problem, she laughed, her laughter sounding a bit louder than usual. All right, it's a deal. I pretended I had just walked in, shutting the door louder than usual. Linda abruptly stopped talking, and her tone changed. I have to go, she said shortly, quickly placing the phone on the counter. Who were you talking to? I asked as I walked into the kitchen. She smiled, but her eyes showed a hint of tension. Rebecca. She was asking about the practice schedule. Her life's a mess as always. Really? I tried to sound like I believed her, but inside, my stomach twisted. A couple of days later, something else happened. During dinner, the three of us were eating together when Tony innocently dropped another comment that made me freeze. Mom, Matt was waiting for you by the door again today. Why doesn't he walk to the car with us? I glanced at Linda. She slowed her fork for just a second, but quickly recovered. Oh, Tony, he just wanted to ask about the fundraiser for the school event. He's helping with the planning, she said casually, too casually. It's nothing. I didn't say anything, but my gaze stayed fixed on her face. She avoided meeting my eyes, as if afraid I might see something she didn't want me to. A week later, I decided to run an experiment. That day, Tony had practice, and Linda was supposed to pick him up from school. I deliberately stayed late at work, making sure I wouldn't be home when they returned. Instead, I drove to the school and parked a little off to the side, watching the entrance. 10 minutes later, I saw them. Tony came bounding out of the building with his backpack, and Linda followed behind him. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a man, tall, athletic, with short blonde hair. They stopped near her car, talking. Linda laughed, and he leaned in slightly to say something. For a moment, their eyes lingered on each other. A lump formed in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The whole world seemed to stop. They weren't touching, weren't doing anything overtly inappropriate, but there was something too intimate in the way they interacted, something I couldn't ignore. When he stepped back and nodded goodbye, Linda stood still for a few more seconds before getting into the car. That evening at dinner, I couldn't hold back any longer. Linda, who is this Matt? I asked. She froze, just for a split second, but I noticed it. Then her face returned to its usual calm. I told you already, he's one of the parents at school. His daughter is in Tony's class. We occasionally run into each other when discussing school stuff, she said in an even tone. Run into each other? Or meet up? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Linda stiffened, her gaze turning icy. Are you serious, John? You think there's something going on between me and this guy? I don't think anything. I'm just asking a question, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. She stood up from the table, throwing her napkin down onto her plate. This is ridiculous. I don't know what you've convinced yourself of, but you clearly need some rest, she said, shaking her head. She went upstairs, leaving me sitting alone in the kitchen. Tony looked at me silently, his eyes wide with fear. I took a deep breath and told him to go to his room. That night, I couldn't sleep. Linda's words kept replaying in my mind. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe I was imagining problems where there weren't any. But every time I recalled the way she looked at Matt by the car, I couldn't shake the doubts gnawing at me. After all the hints and oddities, I knew I had to uncover the truth. Too many little things had come together to form a picture I could no longer ignore. I decided it was time to act. On Friday evening, Linda told me that Tony would be spending the night at a friend's house, and she planned to stop by the supermarket to pick up groceries for the weekend. "Do you need anything?" she asked, standing by the door and pulling on her coat. "No, I'm good," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. She left, and I realized this was my chance. Grabbing my keys, I followed her. I kept my distance, careful not to let her notice she was being tailed. Linda's car didn't head toward the store, but instead drove toward the park on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet spot, usually deserted in the evenings. I parked farther away and turned off my engine. In the dim light of the street lamps, I saw Linda step out of her car and walk toward a bench. Moments later, a figure emerged from the shadows, Matt. They embraced, and this time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a friendly hug. Her hands lingered on his shoulders as he leaned in, and they kissed. It was a kiss that shattered my world. I don't remember how I crossed the distance between my car and them. One second, they were standing close together. The next, I was standing in front of them. What the hell is going on here? My voice was cold, almost a hiss. They turned sharply. Linda's face went pale, and Matt took a step back, as if preparing to flee. "John," Linda began, but her voice was weak. Don't even try to explain," I interrupted, barely holding back my anger. "I saw everything." She froze, her eyes darting between me and Matt, as if searching for an escape. Finally, she stammered. "It's not what? Don't you dare say it's not what I think. I saw you kiss him. So tell me the truth. What's going on here?" Matt took another step back, but I stopped him with a glare. "Don't even think about running. If you decided to destroy my family, you better stay and face the consequences," I snapped, turning back to Linda. "And you. Have you even thought about Tony?" She opened her mouth to say something but closed it again. Then, as if summoning her courage, she finally spoke. I don't know how it happened. It's just, we spent a lot of time together at school, and he was there for me when things got hard." "When things got hard?" My voice rose to a shout. "Hard because of what, Linda? You have a home, a family, a husband who would do anything for you. What else were you missing?" "It's not because of you, John," she exclaimed. "You're a good husband and father. But I just lost myself. It got out of control." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this woman with the one I thought I knew. This wasn't the Linda I loved, the Linda I built my life with. "You lost yourself?" I laughed bitterly. "And now you've found yourself in someone else's arms?" Matt tried to intervene. "John, listen. This isn't all her fault. It's—" "Shut up." I turned to him, my anger barely contained. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You inserted yourself into my family. You destroyed everything we built. Do you even understand what that feels like?" He stepped back, lowering his gaze. "I don't ever want to see you near my wife or my son again," I said, turning back to Linda. "And you made your choice." I turned and walked back to my car, feeling a heavy weight in my chest. When I got home, Linda returned about an hour later. Her face was pale, her expression shaken. She tried to speak to me, but I remained silent. We sat in the living room until she finally broke the silence. "John, I can't say I'm not guilty. I am. I did this, but it never meant anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I looked up at her. "You betrayed me, Linda. You betrayed Tony. This isn't just a mistake you can fix." She covered her face with her hands, but I felt nothing, just emptiness. That night, I went to bed without saying another word. Tomorrow would be a new day, but our life would never be the same. The more I replayed last night's events in my mind, the stronger my desire grew to make them regret everything. Divorce? That was a given. I could no longer imagine living under the same roof with Linda, but that wasn't enough. Matt couldn't walk away from this without consequences. The next day, I took time off work, telling my boss I needed to handle personal matters. I had one goal, to learn everything I could about Matt. I started with the simplest approach, social media. His profile was public, and I spent over an hour analyzing every photo, every post. Tall, well-groomed, always smiling in his pictures, He looked like the perfect man. Divorced, with a daughter he seemed to adore. His daughter. That was the weak point. He wanted to present himself as the ideal father. Fine. I needed to find a way to show the world he wasn't as perfect as he wanted them to believe. I called my friend Mark, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had once helped me with a contract. "Hey, John. What's going on? You sound tense," he said after I introduced myself. "Yeah, Mark, something's happened. I need a divorce, and I want to leave Linda with nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Got it. Are you sure you want to go that hard? You've got a kid involved." "That's exactly why I want to do it right. She betrayed me, Mark. Betrayed our family. She doesn't deserve anything but emptiness." We arranged to meet in a few days to discuss the details, but I needed to start acting now. The next day, I went to Tony's school. Not during class hours, but later in the evening when parents picked up their kids from extracurriculars. I knew I'd find Matt there. And I was right. His car was parked in the same spot where I'd seen it before. He came out of the school with his daughter, her backpack slung over her shoulder while he held her hand. It was a typical, peaceful scene. But to me, it was a reminder of his hypocrisy. How could he ruin someone else's family while pretending to be the perfect father? I waited until he'd helped his daughter into the car, and when he was alone, I approached him. "Hey, Matt," I said, keeping my voice steady. He turned, his face instantly tense. "John, what do you want?" "Oh, I just wanted to ask, how does it feel to live with the knowledge that you've destroyed someone else's family?" I asked, stepping closer. "Look, I don't want any conflict. We're both adults," he said cautiously. "Adults?" I scoffed. "You, an adult, sneaked around with my wife behind my back, and now you want to avoid the fallout?" He averted his eyes, which only fueled my anger. "You know, Matt, you have a weak spot. Your reputation. Your daughter. How do you think people will react when they find out what kind of man you really are?" "Are you threatening me?" His voice hardened, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "No," I replied with a smirk. "I'm just giving you a warning. You picked the wrong person to mess with." I left him standing in the parking lot, feeling like the power had shifted in my favor. That evening, Linda tried to talk to me. She looked exhausted, but I couldn't let myself be soft again. "John, we need to talk about what's next," she began, sitting across from me. "Talk? You want to talk about how you destroyed our family? Or how you're going to explain to Tony why his mom became a stranger?" I replied coldly. "I know I'm at fault, but I don't want Tony to suffer because of this. We can work something out peacefully." Her voice trembled. "Peacefully?" I scoffed. "You forget, Linda. Peace ended the moment you decided to kiss that bastard." She fell silent, lowering her gaze. I saw the pain flash in her eyes, but it didn't move me anymore. "Here's how it's going to be. I'm filing for divorce. You'll keep what you have right now, and let's see how long your happiness with him lasts." I stood in the kitchen, staring at an empty cup. For the first time in a long time, the house was completely silent. No Linda's footsteps, no sound of her on the phone. Tony was asleep in his room, and I knew that everything would be different from now on. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. The divorce was finalized quickly. Mark, my attorney, proved to be a true professional. Linda didn't fight back, almost as if she wanted to end it as soon as possible. She agreed to everything I proposed. I kept the house, full custody of Tony, and control over our finances. She left, taking only a few boxes of personal belongings. Our final conversation was brief. We sat in the living room, facing each other, separated by an invisible chasm. "I want you to know," she said, barely able to meet my gaze, "I truly take responsibility for what I've done, but I never wanted to break up our family." "You wanted another man," I replied coldly, "and that cost you your family." She nodded, staring at her hands. "I'm sorry it turned out this way." "Sorry?" I scoffed. "That doesn't bring everything back." She stood, casting one last glance at the house. "Take care of Tony. He deserves the best." "You could have taken care of him if you'd thought about him sooner," I said, bitterness seeping through my words. She left without looking back. That was the end. Matt disappeared from our lives as quickly as he had entered. Our last encounter came when I filed an anonymous complaint with his company, revealing his behavior outside of work. I don't know what happened next, but his car stopped appearing at the school. Maybe he decided it wasn't worth it. But honestly, it didn't matter anymore. All my energy was now focused on Tony. Explaining to Tony that his mom wouldn't be living with us anymore was the hardest part. But why? We're a family, he said, his eyes filling with tears. I sat next to him and pulled him into a hug. Sometimes families change, Tony. Your mom loves you, but now she'll be living in a different place. That doesn't mean she's not your mom anymore. Do you love her? His question was direct, as only an 8-year-old's question could be. I hesitated. Did I love her? Had I loved the Linda who walked out of our lives? I will always value what we had, I said, looking him in the eyes. But sometimes love ends, and all that's left is respect and care for you. You're the most important thing to both of us. He nodded, wiping his tears. That conversation is one I'll never forget. Now, I'm a single father. The life I once knew is gone, but I found the strength to move forward. Every day, I do everything I can to make sure Tony doesn't feel lost. He smiles, learns, plays with his friends, and that makes me stronger. Yes, it's been hard, but sometimes you lose one thing to find another. Now, my life is just me and Tony, and I can't afford to let him down.